Hello and welcome to episode 34 of the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Dave Ferguson. Dave, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, you're more than welcome, Lewis.
Awesome. Dave, as always, I'll start the podcast with everyone's favorite question. In your own words, what makes you a man?
Yeah, I mean, that is a brilliant question. I almost feel a bit of a cheat because I've watched a couple of your previous podcasts. I knew it was coming, but even so, it is a fantastic question and really kind of what got me into some of your podcasts. Actually, I thought, what a start. Um, so for me, if I had to break it down, I think it would be between the kind of biogenetic kind of basics, if you like, and a more dynamic fluid identity. So, from a biological genetic perspective, I was born a male. There's not a huge amount I could potentially do about that in that sense with, the chromosome and hormonal balance and that type of thing. So that's the kind of basics, if you like, which I'm not sure you can do much about, although some people may argue with that. And I think the more dynamic, fluid aspect is always changing, really. So I've been thinking about this from a kind of generational perspective. So I just knocked the table there. So I kind of remember I've got four children, and I remember I had my daughter, when I was 20 years old. I was pretty young. And at that time, I thought that was kind of job done, really. I've had a child. That means I must be having sex for starters, so everyone would know that. And I thought that's kind of it, really. I must be a man of some sort. Um, then, if I fast forward 27 years, I became a grandfather. And I don't know really what happened, but it was something about that moment. My oldest daughter having children. There were two boys as well. Two boys she's had as well. So I don't know if that makes a difference. But I felt a completely different responsibility, maybe passing on messages, teaching them things, sharing things in life, which I think is a sort of a masculine aspect there. Maybe if I had granddaughters, I don't know if it would be the same thing or not. But it was something that completely changed when I was a grandfather, how I saw myself as a man and my responsibilities. And something similar as well when I got married, because I've been with my partner now for 25 years, my wife now, and we've been married for 10. And again, when we got married and I became her husband, again, there was something completely different that changed there. And I don't know if it was around responsibility. There's probably a spiritual aspect there as well, possibly even more for her, but I think for both of us to some extent, which changed my complete outlook to having a partner and being a husband. And I think as well, if we look where we're at now, I'm sure that's going to change in 5, 10, 20 years' time. I'd be 76 or whatever I'd be then, 20 years' time. Um, Probably have lost more peers, probably parents, uncles, aunties. And that's likely to have some sort of shift of my identity and where I see myself as a man. And there'll be things that we do and say now that we think are absolutely spot on and quite forward thinking and progressive, which will be complete rubbish. And we will look back and say, didn't quite get that. And and maybe yourself, Lewis, maybe your son or your grandson or something by then was saying, Granddad, what the hell were you talking about then? That's absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, I think it's that kind of biogenetic structure and that fluid dynamism that's ever changing, really.
Lovely answer. I really like the ever changing and the fact that you're open to talk about it in 5, 10, 20 years as well, which is one of the main purposes for asking it. So Dave, why don't you tell
Mm.
everyone a little bit about what it is that you do?
Absolutely, of course. So I designed something that's called the Integrated Martial Arts Method about 3.5 years ago. It's aimed exclusively at middle-aged men and in general helps to regain their strength, flexibility, and well-being. And they were three particular large themes that I felt was relevant to me. as a middle-aged man. I'd been one for about 11 years by then, so I thought I had some idea what it was. And I was also at the time still a civil servant, and I had been a civil stroke public servant for about 20 years. Um, and it was during the COVID that I designed the integrated martial arts method. Often I could go to the gym or class, if you like. Um, Various restrictions, of course. Thankfully, Boris did allow us to go out to the parks and things like that, which I thought, what a great man he is, because I that's what I needed and loved. And through that training, I was missing the martial arts. I was doing bits of martial arts that I was been doing for many years. And while they were generally still quite good, they weren't having the same impact during this quite tough period, as it were. So I began to integrate some of the previous martial arts that I'd done from 20, 30 years ago, which weren't that effective in the sense of combat sports, but they were still very effective in the sense of things I enjoyed. And at the time, that was really important. And I then started to combine some of the different arts together into different packages, which seemed, it was a hit and miss at the time, I must admit, but it seemed to be working a bit better in the sense of the impact it had on my body and mood in particular, and some flexibility as well. But sometimes with these things, you're always the last to know, aren't you? So I was doing it thinking I'm getting somewhere. But for me, I think the breakthrough was actually work colleagues, really, and to some extent people at home, but certainly work colleagues who, during this really difficult and challenging time, um, really wanted to know what on earth I was doing, because they were saying, well, hold on a minute, you're looking fairly happy, excited, you're bouncing around the place. We're in the middle of this crisis. We've got to get this vaccination out to our prisons. Um, you know, you can imagine COVID in a prison, the challenges that that may be. And the pressure we had as middle and senior managers was very high. Yet still, I was sort of jumping around the place, laughing and having the time of my life. And people just didn't get it. And I didn't for ages either. And eventually I started just telling people, well, this is what I do to keep my sort of mood and well-being and a bit of fitness. And people were interested in it. I shared some of my knowledge with them, fairly simple stuff. It was all in the test phase, really, in many ways. Um, and people went out there, different managers went out there and sort of followed what I did. And that was that, I thought. And then within weeks, they were coming back and saying how great they were enjoying things and they were doing well and they were feeling a bit better about themselves and they were sleeping a bit better and all these really quite high level outcomes. And I was a bit surprised myself, if I was honest. I was like, really? How did that happen? Because I hadn't really mapped it, hadn't analysed it, hadn't tested it, hadn't compared it, you know. Um, and that was really the start of it. Now, I've recently left the civil service and I'm now doing this full time, expanding it into a full time business. But many of the colleagues that I work with are still in their supposedly high pressure jobs and are still continuing doing stuff from years ago that I helped them with, and it's still helping them today. And that's one of the things I look into, a lot of long term support as well. 2, 3 months, of a diet, for example, is going to be useless because you're going to actually go back to the same behaviors within about the same 2, 3 months. You're going to get absolutely nowhere. And I want to help prepare men for that next stage of their life, throughout their middle age, get themselves in a better condition to prepare themselves for that, dare I say, final stage of life.
Yeah, it's you touched on it a little bit. You touched on COVID, and I always find people have a bit more of a story. As so with myself, I've got a story as why we're doing this podcast today, and a lot of the people that I've interviewed have also got a story. So, is there a little bit more to the COVID side? Is there a little bit more to the story as to why you started looking at fitness and martial arts in particular?
Um, yeah, I think for the COVID side, one thing I certainly took from it, and I'm not sure if this was promoted as strong as it could have been, but one thing I took from it was I've always generally been into keep fit. I've always done a few bits. I've always kept myself in some sort of reasonable condition. That's gone up and down over the years, but the consistency is pretty solid. 40 years of martial arts for starters. over 6 disciplines. But I think with COVID, for me, one of the number one things was, you know, if you keep yourself in reasonable, healthy condition, whatever that means, but let's say from a holistic perspective, that is your physical health, probably your nutritional intake, and your overarching well-being, that probably as much or as more than anything could help you long term when it comes to catching it, when it comes to managing it, and recovering from it. And I'm not sure that was ever pushed in a way that it should have been. And I appreciate some of the dominant things needed. But yeah, in a nutshell, that was just a huge reinforcer to me, kind of things I believed in anyway. But the importance of physical health, nutritional content, and overarching well-being, I thought stood out almost more than anything during COVID, and I wanted to then sort of do something about that.
I think a lot of people had a lot of time to self-reflect during COVID. Some people it was not a great time, but there were a lot of people in privileged positions that were able to come up with different solutions to their well-being or try different things. When you look at middle-aged men in particular, what do you see the difference between someone going down a route of well-being and looking at their fitness at that stage, or let's say the traditional midlife crisis, where you might buy a sports car or trade the wife in for a younger model, let's say? What's the difference there?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the probably differences now is a bit more of a holistic perspective. So it's that recognition that one thing on its own is probably not going to quite cut it. It depends really what else you're doing in your life, for example. But the kind of going to the gym on its own just to be more muscular or generally have a six pack and stuff is a little one dimensional, and it doesn't really answer maybe some of them deeper needs I'd say that middle-aged men may have. And the reason I say that is because, I mean, if you look at it from the basics, in your 20s, it's far easier to probably put on muscle and get that look anyway. And maybe, just maybe, your views are slightly shallow anyway. But in your middle age, you probably need a little more than that. So you probably don't, a six pack is probably okay, but it's actually probably more important to lose just some of that belly fat to reduce some of the levels for that second layer of fat building up. So I think the needs are different, and I think the old identities from your youth, i.e., going to the gym and pumping up, and you're like big man, you're the protector. It's far more complicated when you're not so far more complicated, but less relevant as you get into your middle age. You're not that big man. You're not the bouncer. You're still quite a strong guy, but you're out of shape now. You've lost that identity, and it needs to be replaced with something a bit more complex and holistic. And that's why in my program, a lot of people are really shocked when I talk about things like ADHD or things like that. But you're going to need that understanding to make them kind of fundamental changes, particularly if we even touch on neurology, for example.
Yeah, I like it. I think for me it's really important. I've spoken to a lot of people, and for me it seems to be quite apparent in all ages. It's like I need to go to the gym or I need to start running, and it's like why? It's like, well, I need to be fit. Okay. Is that the best way that you can be fit now at the age of 28, 50, whatever it might be? I always find that they've tried it before and maybe failed, or like you say, when you're in your 20s, it's a bit
Yes,
easier to just
definitely.
hit the gym because you need to for other reasons, let's say. So how do you sort of shift people's mindset into, I guess, trying something new, right? Because martial arts isn't necessarily something everyone's done.
Yeah, I mean, I try and I think it's positive social reinforcements. You kind of show who you are to people, and that kind of gives them some sort of interest. What's going on with this guy here? That kind of, particularly around a local perspective, a lot of people come to me and say, wow, you talk about this, how, what does that actually mean? So when I talk about strength, for example, yeah, there is absolutely some aspect around shoulders, muscles, etc., etc. But when we've got quite a wide definition of strength. So it's often strength of mind, strength of challenge, resilience strength. So we widen it out quite a bit. That does take a bit of work sometimes. But what you often find, Lewis, is even those that do are quite narrow with their strength definition, and sometimes you go with the flow to some extent, but behind that there's some other needs, and you eventually sort of drip feed that in, and people do, almost at least half the time, that initial dominant thing that they talk about, and let's say it is, quite basic strength, and sometimes you can push a little bit to look at, what they need, which doesn't usually match that sort of basic strength model. But yeah, sometimes you go with the flow, and then you just build them theories up, really. Like a lot of the free resource I've got around brain health and middle-aged men's transition, and a lot of these resources have different aspects of strength. So even before they join, they can start to maybe tease out some different strength. But it takes time. Some, I think, you can be quite active, and others you actually do let them go with the flow a little bit. But what almost inevitably happens is when they start talking about their benefits and changes, they're absolutely nothing to do with the original strength stuff. It's much more subtle around it's things like just getting out of bed feeling a bit better. It's getting out of that chair without creaking. Um, it's your wife notice that your humor's back. It's these subtle things that end up being more prominent and dominant than, you know, sort of pumping chest or whatever.
It's a nice byproduct of doing the activity, right? It's a good. It's always there's always something left extra that you didn't realize was there, no matter what you do, right? It's like you say, more
Very
smiley,
much.
yeah, lots of things like that. I'm really big into resilience at the moment. I think it's something that I'm really focusing my research on and sort of my next stage of my own development, because
Interesting.
I've I've been in really dark places and I don't want to be in dark places again. And now that for me is something that I
Mm-hmm.
really want to build up. Can we talk about that from a middle age point of view? Because I'm sort of early 30s and I still have a bit, I feel I still have that bounce back ability because there's still an air of youth to me. But I imagine, and you'll probably sort of fill me in on this, as people get older and we get more used to normal things and we create routine, resilience becomes a little bit harder. So, what is it that you can sort of offer to help build that?
I think for me, it's the experience as well. And it's a kind of, there's a couple of things there really. It's partly to do with what you can and what you can't control, and that can get really messy sometimes. And it's also the recognition, particularly from a middle age perspective, that sometimes things are pretty terrible. Now, that could be at any age, of course. But there's certain things that inevitably will happen as a middle aged person, certain health risks that will increase. Of course, if you keep yourself in decent fitness and things, you can reduce that, but in general, still can increase. And things like bereavement, I'm afraid, for middle-aged men, again at any age, but slight increase at middle age, you will experience more bereavements, depending on your community and things like that. But likely to lose parents, uncles, aunties, and even some peers. Fun stuff this is, Lewis, isn't it? But it's reality,
Yeah.
and to so some extent, you might not be able to control that, for example. So if I look at my own experience, and this is actually quite linked to what led me to designing the integrated martial arts program, not just the COVID context, I had a series of relatively traumatic experiences over quite a short period of time. And in general, I think my resilience is quite good. I'm quite blokey, stoic, quite can handle quite emotional things quite stoically or whatever. Not sure if that's a good thing or not. Sometimes I think it's often can be a blessing and a curse. But for me, even in this case, as far as resilience went, it was really too much. So I had a very good friend of mine suffered a really, really traumatic experience. It impacted us as well. And he was, violently assaulted and received significant brain damage. And he was never the same again because of that significant brain damage. And it was a horrific experience, obviously. And then we had to go for the criminal justice process, which is incredibly challenging. And because I was a criminal justice representative, I was kind of helping everyone through it. But to have to go through that step by step is one thing. Working in the courts and the criminal justice system like I have, but still it's half a step back. To experience it, someone was horrific. And that was kind of the first experience around 2020 at Easter. And then after going back to the story, the case, the individual got sentenced, quite a lengthy sentence, although they appealed. And then several months later, then I lost my auntie. It was a very, very close auntie. In our community, we have lots and lots of aunties, not necessarily genetic, biologically related, but in this case, it was my mother's sister. We were very, very close to her, and she suffered from Alzheimer's, at a quite a poor, quite a serious level, and she passed on. And that was a few months. And then a few months later, I had an involvement with the police, and where my children were being physically harmed, and the police sat by and did nothing. And in fact, escorted the perpetrators away from the scene, like like the rugby union or football, they clap the team, that type of thing. And I just couldn't believe it. And it ended anyway. Cut long story short, with several of the police officers harming me, and spraying them with all sorts of stuff and things and saying it doesn't affect me and all these type of things. And again, another horrific experience. And I think by then, that was probably my resilience levels, if you like, were probably started to deplete.
Yeah.
Sometimes the biggest problem with this, Lewis, is you don't recognize that it's kind of too late, which is a real problem. But I think in hindsight, by then, that was when I was starting to go down quite significantly. And then the final one, and I think I want to share that with the listeners today. I presume most will be men, and a percentage will be middle-aged. So I think it's actually quite important to share this. But bear in mind, this is the fourth of my sort of incidents over about a 10-month period, something like that. So I had an issue, some discomfort in my testes, one of my testes. And it was uncomfortable for a while. I didn't think a huge amount of it, and I thought it was something to do with the cycle shorts or something ridiculous like that. But it was ongoing for several months. And I thought, I, unlike some men, if I don't know what's going on, I will find someone who does. And it's not going to be Google or something, it'll be your practitioner, a psychologist or whatever, whoever. But someone, a professional that can help support and guide you. And I went to doctors, they did a check. It was a female doctor as well. Don't know if that made a difference or not. But it was a kind of worst case scenario because didn't really take it that serious. At one stage says, well, I don't know what that is. And I thought, well, if you don't, I have no idea who does it. Can you tell me someone who does? And that was that. Went away. Really poor diagnosis. Really, I think take some tablets or something, some paracetamol. Was the most ridiculous advice I've ever heard. That continued for several months. I went back again to the GP because I thought this is not quite right. This time it was a male doctor. Again, I'm not saying all male doctors are brilliant and all female doctors aren't or don't understand this. I'm sure there's things, but in this case, it was a male doctor who was really straight away showed that concern. I wish GPs would get this sometimes. It's not just a diagnosis, it's not just a prescription, it's a caring, relaxing type thing as well. But anyway, another story. And he was much more reactive and said, well, it could be this, it could be that. There's a thing that us older men get where our testes drop a little bit, and there's a major muscle, I can't remember the name, and he said it could have been that, for example, that's just, a bit frayed and whatever, that's quite common. So we'll check that out, but also you can have a, what's the thing, oh gosh, not the ultrasound as well. So I left there feeling far more confident. Got the check. think I knew something was wrong because the ultrasound people were really quite candid and didn't say much, which sometimes they do with other times. Oh, it's probably not that much, but they were really like, oh, they'll be in touch with in a couple of days. And I thought, bloody hell, that's the first time I realized something wasn't right. So it turned out that they had found something. They weren't sure if it was malignant or not, but something wasn't quite right. Referred me to a specialist in London. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, they were fantastic appointments, just everything really. Um, and when I went there, I mean, this is actually a woman consultant. Again, really good she was, but she, well, it goes back to your masculinity here, Lewis. Actually, kind of narrow definition of that biomasculinity. She was talking about, we don't know if it's malignant or not, but it's better to go in there, operate it, really really low risk of it coming back. Probably the best thing to do. And I thought, oh, okay, fair enough. But then she started to describe how you could lose your testes and you could have one replaced with a plastic or some plastic type thing. And she was going through it really quickly. And I thought, oh my God, you cannot be telling me about replacing my testes with a plastic replacement at that pace. And going back to that masculinity, that really, it was quite problematic. But by then, my resilience was on overload. I sort of was really struggling then. And I think for me, maybe I had to go through all the experiences, I don't know. But potentially, them different experiences, a lot of my middle aged people I work with will have gone through. Certainly the bereavement aspect, trouble with, at home or relationships, health issues, increased risk of heart attacks, strokes, poor back conditions, sciatica, all these type of things are quite common in the space that I work. So you've got the academic side of it, but that real empirical experience that I think at least helps me empathize and understand some of the resilience and challenging issues that men will go through around health and bereavements and things like that, Lewis.
Yeah, some interesting things you touched on there. I think one of the big ones there for me was it's usually too late when you realize, which I think is all about this proactive approach to resilience
Yeah,
building. And I think
yeah,
even if you do build it, there is going to be chances and there is going to be things that are thrown at you that it's you want to be best, you want to be best case, and then let the world bring the worst rather than worst case and let the world bring the worst, because the end result of that might be completely different to the other side.
yeah.
And also, this week that we're filming this is Men's Health Week. So, gents, if you're listening, please do check certain areas that are specific to us. I think that's really important. And if you find something, go get it checked out. What's the worst that can happen? It's always good.
Absolutely.
It's always good to
Here,
know.
here.
Yeah.
Because
So,
particularly in most of the major men areas, if you like, the prostates, the testicular area, and what else? Well, say let's just stick with them 2 seconds. The early diagnosis is the key. The likelihood of you, successfully being treated and going on and living 100% normal life is extremely high. So that is the key, and as men, I'm not saying you and I'm not saying me, but we're often playing with them areas anyway. So let's use it from a health perspective as well as a pleasure aspect, shall we say?
well, I was going to say, if you start touching them, you might enjoy it after a while anyway. So, but we'll keep it PG for now. The
Absolutely.
last podcast I did was with a guy called Ryan Park. Really, really interesting, and it sort of ties into what you're saying, especially around middle-aged men and those sort of health problems. Obviously, not the bereavement side, but it was all about sort of keeping testosterone levels high and sort of looking at that side of things. And essentially, all male illnesses and things that kill men, ironically, come from low testosterone, which I'm sure doing sport and starting to actually eat better and all of these things are naturally proven to increase or keep testosterone levels at a steady state, which is also really important. So a little sort of synergy of the two podcasts there, which is
Hey.
which is always nice. I think one of the things I really want to touch on with yourself, Dave, is the mental side a little bit more, and really sort of go into that, because martial arts for me and my understanding of it is that's a huge part of it.
Yes, no, absolutely, yeah. And I'm really into brain health as well, so it's kind of I do separate the brain and the mind quite a lot in my assessments. I think it's actually quite important. It just gets conflated too easily. But no doubt about it, martial arts for me has provided that consistency. So even when it wasn't providing, I touched earlier on, it wasn't necessarily providing the sort of shape and physical change that I wanted. You had an enjoyment aspect. So even when I went back to some of my traditional martial arts and our forms and stuff, sort of kung fu guys will know what I'm talking about. Your kind of traditional animal forms. Um, they weren't necessarily doing the job from a physical perspective, but they certainly were helping in the sense I was just enjoying them.
Yeah.
And it's, even if you look at things like nutrition and things like that, you have to start to enjoy them to some extent. So I could tell all my clients, stop eating burgers and chips and start eating quinoa and salads, and that's it. That's your nutrition done. And that's the end of that. But it's so much more complex like that, because you're probably going to really enjoy the burgers and chips. There's stuff going on there with chemical senses and stuff, which old corps are way ahead of us, really. And it's just not quite the same as quinoa and salad. So when one of the reasons I combine so much of the different martial arts is it keeps so much activity in the brain, learning so much new things, that new plasticity that you can improve on your 40s, 50s, and 60s. And if you go back to martial arts over the last thousands of years, some of the traditional ones, well, all the traditional ones actually, they all had a kind of what we would call well-being now. They probably sit a slightly more spiritual aspect, always built in, always that meditative, relaxing, respectful state. That's built into all martial arts. So I kind of bring some of them values, if you like, from the martial arts into some of my training around meditation. Not for everyone. Around prayer, even though it's not necessarily directly associated with the martial arts, but it is that kind of more meditative state, where we know again, through meditation and prayer, there's certain activities in certain regions of the brain that are quite unique. And we know even during going back to COVID, quite an interesting fact, well, for some, but for those that had that kind of more spiritual secondary understanding through prayer and meditation, they seem to be in a better place to manage the kind of the global crisis, as it were. So yeah, really important that side of it, to bring in some of that traditional aspect from thousands of years, which seems to work pretty well, into some of the modern understandings as well.
I like the respect side of it. I think that's really a big thing. It's like you're engaged in a battle essentially for a period of time. If you're doing it from that point of view, but there's still that common respect between you and the person that you're sort of competing with, which I think is a great
Very much so.
skill set to have. Is be competitive, but be respectful of that competition and the person that
Yeah.
you're competing against. So that for me, it's quite nice. It's quite a nice synergy.
No,
You
it's
mentioned,
amazing. I just have to say quickly, Lewis, if that's okay, that some of the relations that I've had through kicking and punching someone have it's almost sort of like you're sort of skipping maybe years and years of getting to know someone. There's something about in that ring. Yes, you got the respect, you got the ref, and you just whatever you do into that person. And then when you finish and you've somehow got through it, and you're a bit busted and bruised, and he's a bit busted and bruised, and you've somehow got through it. The level of respect, there's something going on there, which is it's amazing. Yeah.
yeah, I think there are some other sports that just touch it. I think rugby is probably up there, but I think from for that, it's definitely martial arts and sort of combat sports that have that level of respect. You mentioned something really interesting, which was that you separate mind health and brain health. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, because I suppose going back to the biological basis, so the mind is like a conceptual thing, really. We can't see it, we can't grab it. And of course, some people say it's the same thing, the mind and the brain are the same thing. I wanted to just isolate the brain from a neurological, biological perspective, and to be specific about the regions, what we can do about them, how we can improve that brain, because everyone knows about the basics about the brain, and it's this, and it takes all your calorie and it's full of water, and but how many people know that you're not stuck with the brain that you have? You can actually make it better. You can design things to make it better. You can have nutrients that can help it function slightly better. So I really wanted to just isolate that quite separately. So even if we talk about, I don't know, if I look around nutrition and craving, for example. So I've had people in the program, certainly at the beginning, the first few actually were really, really easy, and they all reported everything had changed brilliantly, and they were all feeling great. And I thought, well, this is a piece of cake. And then I think it was the sixth or seventh person I think I worked with, and they really, really struggled. They started really brilliantly, and then they collapsed pretty quickly, and they went to sort of self-loathing, and they were really in a bit of trouble, and they really struggled with the nutrition. They had started a little bit, and then they would always go back to binging pretty quickly. I couldn't get it, and that really annoyed me. um, so that was at least one of the paths I looked into around. I always had some interest, but not wasn't really structured. A little bit chaotic rather than structured and structured learning. And looking at that nutrition and craving example, there are at least three areas involved when it comes to that kind of process. And you're talking the prefrontal cortex, which is your kind of focus, judgment, impulse control. The basal ganglia, which is kind of center of the brain, your kind of pleasure motivation area. And your deep limbic system around your emotional memory that kind of triggers a behavior. So for me, I listen to 80s music, and I remember the time and what it was like and the summer, and I dance around, and it all feels pretty good. And that would be kind of some relation there to that emotional center. And it's a complex play between them three around your impulse control, what you can and can't handle. And in this particular case, we did a screening test, a brain screening test, through the Amen clinics, very popular neurological area, bit above my board. So just making sure we get that kind of professional guidance there, which you do need in these complex areas. And it was around, in this particular case, really, really poor focus and impulse control, going back to that pleasure really quickly. And we managed through some psychological exercise, some little psychological exercises, and some changing nutritional content and supplements to improve that concentration within the prefrontal cortex. And that over several months, still challenging for the individual, but then cravings are far less frequent and far less intense. And that would be through direct brain work. A little bit of psychology as well, so I'm slightly conscious of myself there, but a real focus on the brain as that specific organ that you could actually make better.
You touched on it before. You said you don't want to do this for 2 or 3 months. You want to turn this into a lifestyle or a change. So it's really interesting that by doing those things and helping the brain, you can essentially rewire yourself to stick at what you're doing for a longer period of time. Cool. So I guess one sort of like final question in regards to everything. What do you think is missing, or what do you think is needed more of in the men's space, and primarily in the middle age men's space?
Yeah, I think it's always difficult. I mean, I think when I first started, I would say everything. Um, but it's always difficult, isn't it? Because now I'm in this space, you can actually see a huge amount of work going on.
Yeah.
And I think without giving ourselves too much of a pat on the back, I think in the coaching space, transformational space, is actually quite vibrant. Um, what I would probably say from a wider societal point of view, and maybe a structural point of view, is a bit more understanding from those in power. Because I used to work in the D&I space, diversity and inclusion, sorry, and really important field, a really important space, where we really, really are aware of some particular groups that may be underrepresented and under cared for. And I talked about my police incident, and I could give you a million figures on black males in the police, for example. So we work in particular groups. But, you know, in that context, for example, men in general, white men and white working class men are off the scene completely. They don't get a mention. Now, some people say, well, that's actually right because, you know, they're most privileged group or whatever. And that might be the case with possibly middle class and possibly more, you know, wealthy, healthy individuals, but it's not with the masses, I'm afraid. So I would like to see, I think in the coaching space, we're doing well. I think it's quite new, and I think things will get better. I think without a doubt, but I would say probably from a wider structural perspective, I would expect a bit more from, you know, regional, national government, NHS. I would expect a little more direct targeting on this particular group. And for some of the reasons that I've mentioned, you know, health, for example, it's the most obvious thing in the world that middle-aged men are likely to have more health-related issues. Why is that not being clarified at a wider national space? So I think in the coaching private space, we're doing well and we'll get better. And that will influence a lot of local, regional impact, which is fantastic. So I could see like a multiple national community shift happening. I think that's really good. It will probably take a while. But I think we need a bit more reinforcement from the wider structural point of view, government, NHS.
Interesting sort of view on it, but I kind of see where you're coming from. I kind of like it. It's I think that's you're right. It's almost grassroots at the moment, private and those sort of things, and it just needs to sort of trickle up, which is hopefully going to happen sooner rather than later. Dave,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a while. I'm going to be honest with you. We've got next government possibly coming in soon. Yeah, it'd
yeah,
be interested in some of their views. I don't see nothing in their manifesto yet, but Labour should be a little bit more on that lines. But yeah, that's another story. Let's not start getting on the political side of things.
yeah, that's definitely another podcast, Dave.
Yeah,
Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you this morning. If
likewise, Lewis.
people have loved what you've heard, where can they find you and how can they hear more?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, there's probably two main links I would say. So the first one, all one word, davefergusoncoach.com. That's my website, basically. So just follow that through. There's lots of free resources there. I think I talked about a couple of the ebooks on middle-aged men's transition, some brain resources if you want to know a little bit more about brain health, a bit more about my total rejuvenation program. That's more aimed at more professionals in general. Um, You've got links to my websites as well, my Facebook group, IMA Wellbeing Group. So that's I think the best resource. But if you wanted to contact me direct message, then that would be dave.ferguson@sky.com.
Amazing, Dave. All of those links will be in the description as well. But thank you so much for your time.
More than appreciate it, Luce.